Hey, this is Mike Robbins. Thanks so much for joining me for this episode of the podcast. Hope you're doing well, you, your family, your team, everyone around you. Today, I want to talk about kindness, leading with kindness. I had a chance last week to attend an event in Berkeley at the Greater Good Science Center, which is a wonderful place that was established by my friend and colleague Dacher Keltner at the University of California at Berkeley. And the focus is really on studying the impact of goodness, of kindness, of, you know, positive emotions and positive connections, and what the impact of that is on society, on relationships, and also on work and teams. And the event last week was really about leading with kindness. And there were some interesting business leaders and university leaders and researchers that were on the panel. And it was a wonderful evening just talking about, just given the state of the country and the world, it can sometimes seem like um, kindness isn't necessarily prioritized in leadership these days. If we look in Washington, if we look on social media or in the news or anywhere. And so I was fascinated to go to this event. I'm a big fan of the Greater Good Science Center and the work that they do, but I really enjoyed the conversation and it got me thinking a bit more about it. And in a lot of ways, while I don't talk directly about kindness, my work focuses more overtly on authenticity and appreciation and gratitude or even compassion. There is an element of kindness that not only have I always thought was important, but I really believe that leaders and teams and human beings that operate with kindness have a distinct advantage. And it's not just one of those nice to haves. It's not just one of those things like, oh, it makes me seem like and sound like a good person. It's fundamentally important. And I think, especially in today's world and with everything that's going on, with all the change, with all the disruption, with all the stress, with all the uncertainty, with, quite frankly, some of the meanness and the cruelty that seems to be out there in sort of mainstream conversations about leadership and, the state of the country and the world, I think us really investing in kindness and how we treat each other, how we operate, the culture that we set, and even how we treat ourselves is fundamentally important. So let's talk a little bit though about some misconceptions about kindness, or what are some things that can get in the way of kindness. I think sometimes we can perceive kindness as weakness or people pleasing. And that's not what it is. Authentic kindness isn't about people pleasing. It isn't about being nice. You often hear people talk about the distinction between nice and kind. And look, not there's anything wrong with being nice. I'd rather interact with nice people than not nice people. I'd rather be a nice person than not a nice person. But I think sometimes when we think about the connotation around niceness, it's more about people pleasing. It's about not ruffling feathers. It's about saying the right thing. It's about not being too controversial. And I don't think that really gets to the depth of what kindness is. Kindness is rooted in respect and courage and truth. It's about, I get a little tripped up when we think about the concepts of right and wrong per se, but kindness is really about doing what's right. It's not about just simply being pleasant and not ruffling feathers. Um, you know, there's a saying that we hear a lot in business and particularly in leadership, which is, being clear is being kind. So giving people feedback, having boundaries, having hard conversations with empathy, letting people know when they're off track in our estimation. It's not, it's nice to not say something, but then it comes up on someone's review or they get fired or the project doesn't go the way we want it to. And we realize, oh, that wasn't actually kind of me. There's a way to give hard feedback with empathy, which we'll talk about. But I think sometimes we misunderstand it. I think sometimes we don't think of kindness as a real differentiator or a real, motivator for performance. And it is, right? Kindness builds psychological safety, which ultimately, as we know from tons of research and things that I've talked about here on this show and in my books, that unlocks performance, that unlocks innovation. We have to have a sense of psychological safety, which is basically group trust to know that we can take risks, we can make mistakes, we can, even fail, not that we want to, but we're not going to get shamed, ridiculed, kicked out of the group simply because we make a mistake. Again, I think we think of kindness as this afterthought, or this, again, nice to have, not need to have. But as I've talked about and written about for years, things like appreciation, things like empathy, compassion, authenticity, all that are kind of in the same realm of kindness, are fundamental not only to our well being, but to our performance, to our connection. Um, it's also important to remember that kindness takes quite a bit of inner work. And one of the reasons why we're not as kind to others as we could be is because we're not very kind to ourselves. So when we're unkind towards ourselves, right? There's the saying that you've heard me say probably many times before, if you've listened to the show or seen me speak: we don't see other people as they are, we see them as we are. So if I'm being judgmental of myself, if I'm being super critical of myself, if I'm being mean to myself, it's going to be hard for me to authentically be genuinely kind towards others. Now, it's often easier to be kind to others than to ourselves, right? But the depth of it, the genuineness of it, the impact of it is significantly altered based on how we're relating to ourselves. And I think we also don't always remember or think about kindness being an action, being a bold action, if you will. It's not simply just a mindset or a way of being, and it can be, but it really is about not only assuming positive intent, but acting on that. So I think we think of kindness in the way of it being soft, it being, not that important or not prioritizing it. But when you really think about your life, you think about yourself as a leader, you think about your teams, your families, your communities. Like, there's another saying that you may have heard that's like, well, we never regret being kind. Now, sometimes we regret being too nice, or not wanting to rock the boat, or not saying something, or not bringing something up. But that's different than being genuinely kind. And as I was sitting there the other night listening to the panelists at this event, and I'll try to send a link, I'll put a link in the show notes if I can find it, of the video of this, because it was, my friend Kia, who works at the Greater Good Science Center, was there, and another one of the researchers there, a couple of researchers on the panel, but there were a couple of business leaders as well, the CEO of HubSpot, and the CHRO of Workhuman, and the former CEO and founder of the 365 brands from Whole Foods, and they were just talking about sharing a bunch of stories and approaches that they have in terms of actually leading with kindness and what the impact is. And it was so inspiring to hear these stories because, again, I think while we all have them and we all know them, and if you think about some of the best leaders you've ever worked for or been around, I would imagine their styles may have been different, their backgrounds, their personalities, their, way of communicating. But I don't personally know of any really great leaders that I've worked with or worked for or been around or observed that don't have some aspect of kindness sort of embedded in how they treat people and how they operate with people. That's part of what makes a great leader great, is his or her ability to be kind, especially when things get hard, especially when things are challenging, especially when tough decisions have to get made, especially when there's, reductions in force or reorganizations or things or hard things that come up. Can we keep our humanity intact while still remembering that operating with kindness matters? I mean, and there's some data that we can look at. There was a report a couple years back from the American Psychological Association that found that 92% of workers say it's important to work for an organization that values their emotional and psychological well-being. Like, that isn't surprising, but if we think about that, like, one of the ways that we do that, one of the ways we create that is by how kind we are to each other at work, right? I mean, there's a lot of data around appreciation that we know. There was a report that came this year's Great Place to Work report came back and found that when employees consistently receive recognition, they're 60% more likely to give an extra effort. So again, recognition, as you've heard me talk about it before, is about performance. It's about outcome, right? However, us being able to notice when people are performing well and actually recognize it, that takes a certain amount of emotional intelligence and awareness from the people around us, from oftentimes the leaders, right? And when people are recognized, it drives their performance and engagement. When people feel valued and appreciated, it enhances that as well. There was a large scale study that was done in the UK, and it found that they were call center workers, and they found that there was a link between happiness at work and productivity in some of the data that they pulled from this particular study. There was a 12% increase in productivity just based on people feeling like they actually were more happy at work. And again, our ability to be kind in how we lead, how we manage, how we interact with people has an impact on people's overall well-being at work and their experience of work. As the saying goes, people don't quit their job, they quit their boss, right? So there's a lot of different studies we can look at that show that kind leaders and kind teams actually produce at a higher level. If you think back over the course of your life and your career, the best teams you've ever been on, the most high performing teams, I bet, and I don't know for sure, but I bet the leaders, your team members, your teammates, there was a level of kindness in how you treated each other and how you interacted with one another. You know, there's this notion that like in order to drive performance, we have to be hardcore and be, brutal. Now look, challenging people, pushing people, holding a high standard, that can all be very motivating, but we do it with a sense of humility, a sense of awareness, a sense of humanity, a sense of kindness. You've heard me talk about this before, and what I've seen from so much research in terms of what really creates the conditions for high performance in teams, it's a healthy high level of expectation. It's got to be healthy, it's got to be clear. Remember, clear is kind, so people know what we're looking for, and we hold people to a high standard. Now, it can't be perfection, because if it's perfection, everybody fails. You can't meet up to perfection, and it also can't be unclear, because if it's unclear, that's not kind. That's not kind. We don't know what we're going for, right? So clear, healthy, and doable. It's got to be like we can actually make it there. Again, if the goal is so out of reach that we can't get there, or it's perfection, we're setting people up for failure. But the other thing that drives performance, so we have that healthy high level of expectation that's clear, but we also have a high level of caring, nurturing, kindness that goes into it. So we expect a lot, we care a lot. We challenge people, but we're kind and appreciative of people, not just their performance, not just what they do and the outcomes, but who they are. So if we do that, that creates the conditions for people to thrive individually, collectively. So what can you do? What can I do? What can we do to enhance the kindness in our relationships, in our teams, in our companies, in the culture? Well, there's several things that we can do, but one thing we can start with is just asking the question is, am I being kind? Is this kind? What I'm about to do, what I'm about to say, is this kind? And if we just check in with ourselves briefly on that, what could I do or say to make this more kind? Again, sometimes we have to deliver hard feedback. Sometimes we have to make tough decisions. Sometimes we have to say no, but we can do that with a sense of kindness. So that's kind of an overarching context to think about. So specific things we can do. You've heard me talk about gratitude and appreciation for years, right? But start meetings and end meetings with gratitude, appreciation. Let people know what you value about them. Talk about good things. Think about things that people are doing. You can express that appreciation. Not blowing smoke. It's not just trying to make people feel good, but let's start with taking some inventory of what's going well, what we can acknowledge and be grateful for or appreciate, even and especially if things are tough, even especially if things aren't going the way we want them to. That brings us more above the line, as I was talking about last week, in terms of fear or stress or frustration. If we can go, okay, look, we have some tough stuff to talk about, or things have been challenging, or we're not on track with some things. We all know that. Let's take a moment, though, consciously to talk about some things that are going well. And at the end of the meeting, similarly, even if it's been a hard, contentious, challenging meeting, before we wrap up, can we just talk a little bit about what we accomplished or what went well during this conversation? I know it can sound a little corny, a little cheesy, but just like letting people know that we see them and we care about them as humans and looking for some good stuff, right? Look, I'm biased in this regard. You know that. I wrote a book, my first book, all those years ago called Focus on the Good Stuff. But that's one way to really get us into that realm of kindness. A second thing we can do is remember when we're delivering hard feedback or have to talk about something challenging, when we have to have one of those, as I call them, sweaty palm conversations, can we bring a sense of kindness and compassion to the conversation, even if it's hard? Again, we're not sugarcoating it. We're not placating people in some condescending way. It's just we can be honest and compassionate. We can be direct and kind. They're not contradictory. They're not mutually exclusive. Now, people might not always like the feedback. They might not like the decision, but there's a way in which we can go about it. You can even look, if you've ever had to fire someone or let someone go, that's a really hard conversation to have, both the giving and the receiving of that conversation. But you can do it with heart, with humility, with humanity, and ultimately with kindness. So just bring that into the conversation as much as possible. Third thing we can do is check in with people, not just check up on what they're doing or managing tasks, but actually check in with the human. I know it sounds simple, but like, Michelle, my wife would often, read a lot of parenting books, especially when the girls were young. And as they were getting older and they were getting into adolescence and there was more, and now, I mean, they're 19 and 17. So we're still dealing with adolescence, although, one's off in college, Samantha's in college and, about to turn 20 in, gosh, about 2 months. And, Rosie's still in high school, but it's like Michelle would say to me all the time as a reminder, connect before you correct. And I think that's true whether we're parenting young children or adolescents or young adults or managing people, or just like, can we connect before we correct or before we dive into? I was on a Zoom call earlier today and we spent the first 15 minutes just talking about all kinds of life stuff. And it simply came from like, the background in Zoom, I saw he had, a Steelers helmet. And we started talking about football and sports and where he grew up and where I grew up. And again, I wasn't doing it just to schmooze per se, but we were getting to know each other. We'd met a few times, but we were just having conversation human to human, where kids, family, this, that moves. And to me, I find, yeah, that's a way to connect. That's a way to find relatability. But there's also a way in which we're kind of finding out how people are doing. Like I remember in the early days of the pandemic, I would get on a lot of Zoom calls or Microsoft Teams calls or Skype calls or WebEx calls, video calls with people. And the first thing I would often ask is like, how are you? Like, how is all of this impacting you? And I wasn't trying to be melodramatic about it, but I did appreciate it. It felt like there was even more space and more understanding that we were going to actually ask, how are you? How's it going? Not just as a greeting, but as a genuine question. So can we check in with people, and even get creative with that? I remember hearing my friend Jason speak a couple years ago at Work Human Live, and he said one of the things he invites the managers and leaders that he works with and coaches to do is when they meet with their teams one-on-one to just ask, 0 to 10, how you doing? And just that alone, because if someone says 2, that's a different follow-up question than if someone says 9. You could ask your kids that. You could ask your spouse that. I mean, but just to dive into the question, right? What are you feeling excited about? What are you feeling scared about? Just check in with them as a human before diving into the task. Let them know I see you. I care about you as a human. Even if we only have 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes to, get through a bunch of stuff, it's important to get related, get connected. The fourth thing we can do, and this one is so fundamental, but challenging, and that is be kind to ourselves. Look, again, we don't see other people as they are, we see them as we are. So the kinder we can be, the more kindness we can bring to ourselves, the more authentically kind we can be to others. The more critical and negative and, hardcore we are towards ourselves, that's going to naturally spill out on others. It's going to be harder for us to be kind to others if we're not being kind to ourselves. So Brene Brown says, talk to yourself as if you're talking to someone you really love. Can we do that? Can we relate to ourselves with that type of kindness? And then the fifth thing we can do is to model small moments of care. Just find those little moments. Kindness tends to compound. Little moments, little check-ins, little things. The more, every time we lead with kindness, and we're talking about leading like leadership, leading others, but it's just leading, bringing kindness first. And if you are in a leadership position and you lead with kindness, it makes it safer for other people to do the same. It has an impact on them. It sets the tone. It's super important. And a little bit goes a long way. So those five things, right? Starting and ending meetings with gratitude, with appreciation, delivering feedback with kindness, with compassion, having those sweaty palm conversations, prioritizing kindness, checking in with people as humans before we dive into the tasks and the projects and the accountabilities and all those things, being kind to ourselves, and then finding small moments where we can bring that sense of care, that sense of compassion, that sense of kindness. It compounds, it builds. And the more you do it, the safer you make it for others. Look, I think kindness is one of the most underrated leadership skills and performance skills. It doesn't mean we avoid hard truths. It means we're willing to communicate and even deliver some of those hard truths with care, with heart. When we lead with kindness, we don't just build better teams, we build better relationships and ultimately better humans. And that's, I think, what we're really looking for. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. As always, I appreciate it. Check out the show notes for, again, hopefully a link, if I can find it, to the video of that Greater Good Science Center event that I went to last week that was fantastic. You can also find links in the show notes for how to connect with me on social media and learn more about me and my work. Best place to do that is at our website, which is mikedrobbins.com. Feel free to leave a rating or a review right here in whatever podcast app or platform you happen to listen to this on or are watching it on, and feel free to share it with anyone you think might benefit. Always appreciate when you do that. Until next time, keep bringing your whole self to work, to life, and remember, we're all in this thing together.